We see you as you sit behind the wheel of your truck. We see you shake out the nerves before you pick up your hammer, your scissors, your pots and pans. As you find new ways to keep the lights on and put the pieces back together, we see you. As you straighten the rows, keep your customers safe, and crunch the numbers, we see you. As you head back to work, we see you. You've got this. We're open to help you reopen. Visit bbb.org.
And welcome to this BBB Building Trust in Trying Times webinar. I'm your host, Dale Dixon. So good to have you with us today. We have a very important topic on tap today as we start to look at reopening businesses in so many states, some of the considerations businesses need to be making, especially smaller businesses. So the topic of today's webinar, a roadmap to reopening, return to workplace considerations for service trade employers during the COVID-19 pandemic. This webinar is interactive. It is live for BBB accredited businesses. And when we talk about an accredited business, that is a business that has made a commitment to uphold BBB's standards for trust, to be honest, to be ethical, to really set a high bar in the marketplace for doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. If you're one of those businesses, thank you so much for making that commitment to make our world a better place through being in business. And as we work through today's webinar, it is open for Q&A, questions and answers with our expert. And we look forward to answering your questions today. The best way to do it is to use that Q&A box in the Zoom tool at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you just look at the bottom, you'll see Q&A. You might need to wake it up. Go ahead, type your questions there. Also, take a moment and read through the questions that are popping up in the Q&A box, because you can upvote those questions, and we'll answer the questions that have the most upvotes first. They surface to the top and work through that. We do have a limited amount of time today, at about 30 minutes for our presenter, and we'll get through as many questions as possible. And we're looking forward to this time today with Amy Robinson. She's an attorney with Miller, Nash, Graham, and Dunn, LLP. Amy represents public and private employers in a broad range of workplace and workplace-related issues. She provides experienced counsel on compliance challenges and disputes covering the entire employment life cycle, from hiring to separation, including employee classification, wage and hour issues, employee leaves and protected activities, disability, accommodation, discrimination, retaliation, and harassment prevention. Amy's clients range from small businesses with a single location to large employers with multiple locations, and she particularly enjoys the strategic and proactive approach that today's workplace culture requires. So Amy, so good to have you with us today. We appreciate your time with us on the webinar. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dale. I appreciate it. And I know that that bio was a mouthful. Let me get my screen sharing here so that we can get moving with our program today. Let's see. All right. Is that visible for you?
That looks fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to try to cover, there is a lot of material, a lot of changing information. So this material is we're going to try to kind of harmonize it as much as we can and get as much information out to you today. We've got a short amount of time. You'll have access to my contact information with questions for afterwards, as well as a link to our website that has a lot more in-depth content on much of the topics we'll be talking about today. But I thought probably because most of us are missing those vacations we'd had scheduled as we're hunkered in making things work, I'm taking us on a road trip today to enjoy ourselves along the way as we work on some reopening considerations. But first and foremost, let me get my mouse working here. I want to set some rules of the road that are in play as you start determining whether you've been in operations because you're essential and trying to figure out where requirements are, or if you've been fully closed and are working to implement reopening planning but haven't gotten there yet, or if you're somewhere in between. The number one responsibility, and this predates the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic, so still a baseline rule of the road that's at play, is the duty to provide a safe and healthy workplace for your employees. That is derivative of the Occupational Safety and Health Act's General Duty Clause. I know there was a presentation last week that covered much of this Thankfully, that'll allow me to be a little more abbreviated with this information, but that really sets the baseline standard for what businesses need to be thinking about as they start implementing planning and deciding what preventative measures they want to undertake as they resume operations. In particular, the obligation means avoiding what's considered to be a known hazard. Now, as the pandemic has evolved, COVID-19 has become a known hazard that may impact the workplace. So it's important that you know how and where it may impact your workplace. OSHA has two particular, what I call really content-heavy guidance resources that are available I want to mention. And one is the guidance on preparing workplaces for COVID-19 that was done very early on in March as the virus was arriving in the US, and recently guidance on returning to work. Those in tandem really help illustrate what the basic requirements for a safe and healthy workplace are in the context of COVID. Of course, most states have their own state equivalent version of OSHA, and each will have their own guidance as well. Much of that guidance in understanding the hazard that is COVID-19 really intersects with guidance from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. So early on in the process, the CDC published what's called interim guidance for businesses and employers. I get this question a lot. Interim guidance, is there ever going to be permanent guidance? I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you interim guidance has continued to be updated, and even though it says interim, it really is the current guidance that is a resource right now to know what preventative measures, what symptomology looks like, that kind of information. Also recently, a flow chart that will help illustrate pre-planning considerations as well as a toolkit for businesses. So I wanted to mention those as reference points for you. But as we start with the obligation of a safe and healthy workplace, we also have to balance that with the obligation to also consider employee privacy protections and other potential employee protections that are at play. But a big one in this context comes with given that COVID is potentially medical information, the knowledge that an employee may have the virus, may have experienced the virus information, or may have been exposed to the virus, that is potential health information. And just a reminder, again, this predates the pandemic, but is baseline guidance that is still in play and we have to evolve it to include COVID. The EEOC recently came out with guidance that answers questions like, can I ask my employees whether they've been exposed? Can I ask for other information? Can I require them to take tests? All of those things are actually a product of some of these other laws, and there is new guidance around that. So on one hand, we want to make sure we're providing a safe and healthy workplace. On the other hand, we want to make sure that in our efforts to do so, we're not overstepping on some employee privacy protections that are at play. So those are sort of our baseline. So I mentioned the CDC resource around reopening. And I'm sorry, this is a little small, but the visual I wanted you to get a chance to see here that really talks about what are the basic considerations to know, are we in a place where we should be opening? That first column on the left there says, will reopening be consistent with applicable state and local orders? Given that there's not been a national decision in this regard, all of these stay home, stay healthy, shelter in place have all happened at the state level. Talk about that more in a minute. But that's really the first consideration. If the answer there is no, the second question, by the way, also says, are you ready to protect employees who may be higher risk? There's a red stop sign there that says do not open. Assuming you're able to open under your current state rules, then we get into the other columns, which are you prepared to do so safely, and what steps have you taken? So we'll talk about those more, but that's really the layering of considerations that are at play. So I want to talk for a minute. As I mentioned, there was no national decision around closures or that kind of thing. So what that means is it's all happened at the state and local levels. how that has played out and how that may impact your reopening or return to work planning is based on how those closures occurred and the strategies in doing so. There may be very diverging approaches in different jurisdictions. Let me give you an example of that. I practice regularly in Oregon and Washington, as well as Alaska, incidentally. But in Oregon and Washington, I consider them to have, and I've described it as a bit of a mirror image in responses to how their shutdown occurred. What I mean by that is, on the Washington side of the Columbia River here, Washington really took the approach that everybody was to shut down unless they were on the essential business list, and that list was specifically prescribed. What that meant was, as the phases of reopening occur, we're getting very industry-specific guidance, industry-specific opening rules, targeting certain businesses beyond the essential businesses that are able to open. On the other hand, in the mirror image in Oregon, it was anybody can stay open so long except for these specific, particularly public-facing industries, things like bars, restaurants, salons, those kinds of things. So only certain businesses closed entirely. Otherwise, businesses not within those lists were able to operate so long as they had appropriate social distancing requirements met. So very different approaches, which then means reopening guidance in Oregon and Washington looks very different. Oregon is issuing guidance to the businesses that closed and not necessarily to the businesses who it believes are already open. Although as we get further into the phasing, we're getting more guidance that's generally applicable. On the Washington side, very targeted guidance early on. For example, as phase one construction was one of the first industries opened and more industry specific. So particularly at the state level, what specifically is required to operate is going to be very local. It's going to be very industry specific potentially. So be aware of that. What that also means for purposes of our conversation today is I'm going to try to take an approach that really harmonizes what the common ground amongst all of those requirements is. Things that will generally apply to everybody. But again, you'll want to consult your local state and or local officials. Most government sites have a COVID page you can go right to make sure you're working with the current executive order. And those will, and check for industry specific guidance. But this is going to be kind of a harmonization of that. So these criteria will tell you, can you open? Are we within the rules allowed by law? The reason I mentioned the OSHA requirements is the other consideration obviously is, can you do so safely? So the state and local acts will tell you, can you do it at all? These other considerations will tell you, are you doing enough to do so safely? Okay, so what does that look like in practice with that context for it? Now we're on the road here. First and foremost, you want to have a written plan, protocols, whatever you want to call it. That's not important. What is important is that you're very clear about what safety practices and protocols you want to impose to make sure that you're able to prevent to the fullest extent possible COVID from coming into your workplace. So first and foremost, educate your managers and all of your employees on the symptoms of COVID-19 and how it's transmitted. Just to note, that has been a moving target, just as many things have along the way here. Initially, that was just thought to be fever, cough, respiratory issues. Now it is expanded. The CDC's guidance is kind of the baseline there for those rules. It talks now about a much longer list that includes things like loss of taste or smell, sudden loss of that's not explained by other circumstances. It may include other flu-like symptoms. So you want to make sure you're familiar with what those signs are so that you can be monitoring appropriately. You also, primary plan is make sure that employees know, do not come to work if you're sick, if you've been exposed to the virus, or if you're experiencing symptoms associated with COVID-19. Want to make sure those plans clearly require that employees report that to you so you're aware and can make sure that you're not allowing the virus knowingly into your workplace. And obviously I mentioned the confidentiality requirements that are at play with a potential exposure. Let me take a side note for you. The takeaway on confidentiality here has been, and consistent with the EEOC's guidance that came along the way, is you are not able to share specific information around symptomology, nor should you be sharing the exposed employee's name, but you are able to take steps to acknowledge that there was an exposure when you're maybe needing to deal with notifying some of the folks who may have had contact with this employee to be mindful to watch for symptomology or get tested or those kinds of things. So you can share that to be able to take the appropriate corrective steps, but you shouldn't be sharing the name of the employee or any of their personal symptomology. You also likewise, to the extent that any information shared is captured in writing, you want to make sure you're considering your record keeping requirements. In some businesses, if it's workplace related exposure, there may be OSHA related record keeping. Likewise at the state level, similar expectations. So continuing on with that, you want to make sure you also are prepared for what if an employee becomes ill after they've arrived, or how do you handle that as you've asked folks to come forward and identify if they're feeling ill or feeling that they may have been exposed. Be prepared for that. In particular, 2 takeaways that I would say. Number 1, consider creating your list of questions, your dialogue with potentially exposed employees in advance. So number 1, you can be consistent with what you're asking. You really want to get information to assess what steps you may need to take in the workplace to either inform folks that they may have had contact. You may need to take steps to clean, that kind of thing. And again, you will need to make an assessment if you believe this may have occurred in the workplace to determine recording. And there now are coming along, depending in certain jurisdictions, potential obligations. If you know of workplace exposure, there may now be an obligation to notify public health. Early on in this process, we had as clear as it gets in the current world, we had guidance that said, employers, it's not your responsibility to notify public health of potential exposure. That happens at the healthcare provider testing level as part of the testing that the employee will go for. But now, and particularly I note in Washington, once we get to phase 3, there will be a notice, an obligation for employers to potentially notify their local public health officials, so be aware of that. Likewise, in some counties in Oregon, there's an obligation if there's at least 2 potential workplace exposures to notify public health. So I just want to mention that as a potential issue, so as you're planning, you can be prepared for that. Again, as I've said a couple times now, make sure you know what you can and can't share. That's the other benefit of having messages prepared in advance. Then you're ready to not overshare, but to know just what information you do need. And make sure you've designated, if you're in limited operations in particular, make sure you've got clear authority on the ground. There's a manager in place who knows and is entrusted with making sure they're watching for signs, symptoms. They're in charge with enforcing safety protocols. You want to make sure you've delegated that and are clear in your policies, protocols, what that looks like. Additional things to consider, again, we're in the OSHA realm, so I'm going to move really quickly here, but being really proactive with screening. In some industries, certainly screening, meaning pre-shift, pre-arrival, questions around symptomology, questions around do you have a fever, and as you know, many are mandating that those screenings happen at the work site. In fact, phase 1 construction, in Washington, you had to do it at the work site, taking temperatures of employees. In some other areas, jurisdictions, and industries, you can have the employee check their temperature and affirm they are asymptomatic and don't have a fever before they come in. In other contexts, you have to confirm that upon arrival. So make sure you've thought that through. Likewise, make sure there's not a gap there, that you're taking care of all of this with your employees, and yet you have visitors, contractors, others freely coming in. You want to make sure those same screening mechanisms are applied within the right context, and that you may need to record, if there's not already a mandate at the local level, that you may need to capture that information for purposes of your own due diligence if there is an exposure of notifying or cooperating with public health officials who are doing tracing. Of course, the big takeaway from all of this that we've learned is the rigorous personal hygiene. We've all learned the 20-second song to wash our hands, you know, those kinds of efforts, respiratory practices, you know, cough into your elbow, not your hands anymore. So you want to stay diligent. Lots of posters and proactive methods to help communicate those expectations. Social distancing, there are some things you want to be thinking about as far as reopening planning. Do you need to readjust the physical office environment? Do you need to be including partitions? Do you need to stagger shifts so you don't have so much overlap? Do you need to assign certain lunchrooms or certain bathrooms to folks to minimize the opportunity for exposure? Masks, just a quick concept. This is, again, very localized, and I know there's lots of energy around this issue. I will tell you, at this point, as of today, at the federal level, it is encouraged, recommended, but not required. OSHA takes the position, unless more is required by virtue of an industry such as healthcare or others, cloth face masks are not considered PPE that must be provided at the employer's expense. That is not necessarily the case at the local jurisdiction level. In Washington, for example, exact opposite. Employers are required to mandate it and required to provide them. Very different amongst states, I recognize. So be aware that you want to check what your local requirement is, know that they will differ, and be aware that there may be opportunities where you may have to consider exceptions. That is a particularly hot button issue right now, I recognize, but also one that has some legal complexities to it. So I would recommend, if you get into a pretty in-depth dispute around mask wearing, that is one I really would say would benefit from some independent counsel advice on that issue, because they can be quite fact specific. Physical distancing measures, I borrowed from my home state of Alaska here on some of their postings. If you didn't know it, and you're having a hard time conceptualizing what 6 foot is, think about a moose. Isn't that where everybody's head goes, right? Being proactive about implementing those measures is another thing. Sanitation is important to consider, obviously, making sure shared equipment, you're planning appropriately for that. Disinfecting schedules, considering clipboards, for example, in conference rooms to confirm that they've been cleaned between use. Scheduling additional time gaps for proper cleaning. Of course, with those also comes considering PPE requirements that may be required under the OSHA guidance for those who use the disinfectants. Make sure you're using CDC approved disinfectants that are useful to the virus, and consider your safety data sheets that you may need to have on record for the cleaning supplies you're using. Okay, we're through the OSHA portion. I'm gonna jet through the rest of this, but there's a couple of really important concepts I want to get to, and this really is the big takeaway here. So I'm going to stay on this slide for a little bit, but there are going to be circumstances where you may be ready open. You've taken all of the actions that you think you need to have. Maybe you even have a whole new redesign of your space. You know it's safe. You're ready to go. There still may be circumstances where you're ready to go, but you aren't able to demand that employee return. And here's when that may apply. Number one, during this process, Congress adopted the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which provides an opportunity for an entitlement for the employee to be gone from work for protected leave, which means you can't replace them, and it's paid leave for certain reasons. So let me digress from this, and I'm calling this our side trip, our detour on our road here. So these leaves are going to apply to small business, those with less than 500 employees. It became effective on April 1. It still will be effective through December 31st. So even though we're further through the virus, be aware this is still in effect until December 31st. There's two types. Let me talk about that. Emergency paid sick leave is up to 2 weeks of paid leave, capped at 80 hours if an employee works more than that, for one of 6 potential reasons. I say 6 because that's what's on the poster, but in reality right now there's only 5, because 6 is a very generic one that's going to be available should some new issue come up. So if an employee is quarantined by a public health official or their doctor, that may be triggered. If the employee is symptomatic and is needing testing and seeking a diagnosis, that may be triggered. Likewise, if they're needed to care for somebody who's quarantined, it may be triggered. And the fifth one is a big item right now, especially as schools are working on planning. If the employee can't work or telework because their child's school or place of care is closed. You'll see asterisks here because with very rare exception, and this is one of them, there is no small business exception. So even though I mentioned that this is applicable to all employers under 500, there's a healthcare exception for healthcare employers, but otherwise, these are all mandatory leaves. This fifth reason that I'm mentioning has a small business exception for employers with less than 50 employees. We don't have time to go into the full details from it, but suffice it to say it's an individualized determination based on the need for leave and the conditions of the business at the time. So it's not categorical to all of this. And we have a great resource on that on our website, lots of information out there. The second type, as I mentioned, is emergency family medical leave. That's up to 12 weeks. Similar to reason 5, which is if the employee can't work or telework because the school is closed. The employee must have worked for at least 30 days. And if the business is already FMLA covered, this applies to that amount. So if somebody had FMLA leave and you're a business that is of more than 50, those would count toward that entitlement. So it's important to know about those leaves. Coming back to the others that may be there, state mandated sick leaves. If you're in a state where there's mandated sick leaves, most of those include things like the employee's own illness, so COVID would trigger that. They also may include closure of the school or daycare due to public health concerns. COVID is certainly that. So make sure you've considered whether that leave applies before you take any action. And likewise, medical leaves. Standard medical leaves typically wouldn't apply to just I might be sick or am self-quarantining for COVID. However, if the employee is hospitalized or experiencing serious symptoms, they may be. So just mention that. The last two are really important here, which is if an employee has an underlying health condition that might be physical, that might be that they have something that makes them particularly vulnerable to COVID, or a potentially mental health condition where the stress of COVID is creating issues for them. They may be entitled to be out as by virtue of our disabilities laws. So be careful with those issues. And lastly, Washington uniquely has adopted a high-risk worker proclamation from the governor that says employees who have underlying health conditions or are, I think it's over 65, age-related vulnerabilities to COVID cannot be required to work right now so cannot be required to work, and you have to explore all alternative arrangements, or you have to provide them with leave until they're able to return. So if there isn't a way to keep them engaged or working via telework or otherwise, then they are entitled to be gone right now. It's not paid leave, it's unpaid leave, but they would be entitled to unemployment. You likely may have an obligation to maintain health insurance benefits, and they would be entitled to return to their job. That proclamation right now originally was set to expire June 12th. It was extended to August 1. We're anticipating it will be extended again, but it has not been yet. But stay tuned for that. Obviously, update, lots of changes in our worlds with this going on, and I want to wrap this up so we have time to get to those questions I see. Policies, practices, and trainings, make sure you're being proactive to update your training employees about this. Don't miss your telework, folks, by the way. I'm seeing lots of times where employers are spending all the great energy to get things updated, but they've got only a portion of their population in the workplace, and they're forgetting to send that information or make arrangements to get those folks who are teleworking trained. Make sure you're considering that. Likewise, if you've adjusted schedules, maybe you've extended the day and working less days, make sure you're still in compliance with the meal and rest break requirements in your location. Often there's a threshold past an 8-hour shift that triggers an additional rest and or meal break. So make sure you're thinking about that. Likewise, many businesses prior to this had a policy in their handbook that said we don't allow telework. And yet in March, lots of people were sent home to telework. Now is the time to get clearer about whether you allow telework and under what circumstances, and make sure your policy is adjusted accordingly. Because there may be specific requirements for telework that you didn't have time to implement, but you want to start implementing now. Posters, make sure your posters are up to date. Again, don't forget virtual workers. And lastly, keep employees informed and engaged in prevention. I will tell you I expect things to continue to change. Steps you may need to take will continue to change. Information about the virus or preventative measures may change. Be transparent about that now. When you're doing these policies, when you're doing these protocols, these are not documents that are going to be able to be put in print and never changed again, and you're digging them out of a drawer in 15 years. These are living, breathing documents right now. So be transparent about that. That will hopefully elicit better cooperation. And of course, you cannot hear from somebody who practices law and not hear something about reminding you to document your decisions, so that you can show all the good steps you took to consider options and take appropriate steps should for some reason you need to be produce that. So I'm gonna tie that up here and see if we have any questions to get to, because I already did more talking than I meant to, but lots of information. Sorry for the drinking from a fire hose.
Amy, it was fantastic. Exactly what we needed to hear. And, Deborah is asking, is there a way to get a copy of this presentation, which is great news to say, hey, this is exactly what we need to hear. So I'm going to ask our team, we've got Jason and Jamie working in the background, and they're going to post a link to our YouTube page where a recording of this webinar will be made available, and you can watch it, and that should be up later today. So yes, the recording is going to be available, and that link is on our YouTube page, and really easy to find, easy to watch. You can share it with others because the information has been fantastic. So Amy, Bob posted a question before you arrived to the point where you gave the information in the presentation, but the information is so good, and I want to make sure that Bob gets this along with our other participants. So I'm wondering if it would be a good idea to answer Bob's question with an executive summary. Bob wrote, what are the reporting requirements when an employee tests positive?
That's a great question. So first and foremost, if they test positive, the question really is, there may be no reporting obligation. So there would be no reporting obligation if it was not related to the workplace. So for example, many employers are implementing in their post exposure or illness follow-up questions that I mentioned, I recommend you have ready, asking the employee, where do you believe you may have been exposed? That employee may say, oh gosh, I know right where it was. I was at a family event last week, and my cousin, I just found out they had it, and this is where it came from. So if you have, and this is consistent, by the way, with OSHA's guidance on this, if the employer has a reasonable basis to believe it's not workplace related, no OSHA reporting obligation. I believe all the state guidance is going to fall in line with that. Also, you want to, the second potential reporting obligation is that one I mentioned, and this is new and moving, is that public health official notification. If you're in a jurisdiction where notification of employee exposure is required, that may be triggered there. So far, that may or may not be the case if it's not workplace related, or for example, if the employee tells you they've already tested positive, they're probably they've already been noticed. But for example, phase 3 guidance in Washington may impose an obligation to report to public health. In other jurisdictions, only if it was the second of a potential workplace exposure, public health wants to know so they can get into the workplace faster. But so if you have credible information that it's not workplace related, probably no reporting obligation from an OSHA perspective, subject to the question about public health. If it's workplace related, that will depend on OSHA's guidance then on whether you're in a category that requires you to record injuries. And certainly there's also that requirement if there is a hospitalization or a death, there's some even if you're not in an industry that has recording obligations, you may have reporting obligations. Those are different, even though similar words, that you'll want to be aware of. So hopefully that's helpful.
Very much so. Amy, I'll let you know that our team has put and I'll let our listeners know that the team has put the links to all the webinars and where this webinar will be posted in the chat box. So that goes away once this webinar is over. So I'd encourage you to go check that chat box, copy that webinar, post it into your favorite web browser so that you can go and take a look at this upcoming webinar that's going to be posted along with all of our recent webinars. Mark asks Amy, do you have a source for a reopening template that we could modify to fit our proprietary needs? It would be great if one existed, much like a state-specific employee manual template that had been legally determined to meet state requirements.
I wish I had the perfect solution for every single scenario for everybody on this on the webinar today. The short answer I can tell you is there is phase 3 safety plan. My terminology, a template phase 3 safety plan. Thank you. That wasn't that hard. For Washington, on the governor's website. So, and I'm happy if you want to reach out, I'm happy to send that link. But that will meet the obligations for phase 3 once, if you're already in, there are a few counties in phase 3 already in Washington, and will be required for anybody else who's in phase 3. You'll want to, of course, check any industry specific additional requirements, but there is a template safety plan for phase 3 guidance for Washington. And frankly, I'm not aware of another one, since again, most of the other jurisdictions aren't quite as prescriptive based on the way they handled the closures. That's one. I will also tell you, I mentioned we've been necessarily publishing a lot of resources. We've got another, I've got a kind of a one-stop reopening checklist that has a lot of links to information too on our website. So that might be another one that covers more than just a safety plan. The safety plan template is all of the initial things I mentioned. Are you confirming that folks are taking wearing masks and social distancing? Where's your plan? Who is your designated contact? Those kinds of things. But if you're talking about the full gamut of, have you also thought about updating your policies? I'm not aware of one as of yet that harmonizes everything, certainly not on a national basis, let alone on a regional basis, unfortunately.
I think one of the things that we could recommend our viewers do is just do a Google search based on their location, because we have viewers from throughout North America, US and Canada on this webinar right now. So specific to your region, your location, just do a Google search and see if there's anything that shows up, as a number of entities, government and non-government, are posting information that could be would be updated on a regular basis. And there's a lot out there. It takes extra time to sift through it, but we've got a really good basis to know how to gauge that information, what to watch for based on the information you've provided today. So Amy, thank you so much. With that, our questions are answered, and you have given us a lot to chew on, a lot to think about, and a lot to implement in our businesses. We are so grateful for that, Amy. We really appreciate it. And we're going to say goodbye for now. Once again, this webinar is going to be recorded. If you have not grabbed the link, it is in the chat box. Click the chat function in the bottom of your screen. You'll see the link there. Go ahead and highlight, copy that, and then paste it into your browser, and you'll be able to find it. Also a search on YouTube for BBB and these topics. It'll be easy for you to see. So we really appreciate you being with us. Amy, again, thank you so much for your time. And with that, we're going to sign off and say goodbye and have a great day.
Thanks so much.